Easy English audiobook.
The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. This story is both strange and simple. I don't expect you to believe it. I would be foolish to think you would, especially when my own senses tell me it can't be true. But I am not mad, and I am not dreaming. Tomorrow I die, and today I want to unburden my soul. My goal is to share with you a series of everyday events that have terrified, tortured, and ruined me. I won't try to explain them, but I will tell you the story as clearly and plainly as I can. To me, these events have brought nothing but horror, though others might find them less terrible. Perhaps in the future, someone with a calmer and more logical mind might see these events as nothing more than ordinary causes and effects. From a young age, I was known for my gentle and kind nature. My heart was so tender that others made fun of me. I loved animals and was allowed by my parents to have many pets. I spent most of my time with them and was happiest when feeding and petting them. This love for animals grew as I got older, and as an adult, it became one of my main sources of joy. For anyone who has loved a loyal dog, I don't need to explain the deep satisfaction that comes from such love. There is something about the selfless and devoted love of an animal that touches the heart of anyone who has been disappointed by the fickle friendships of people. I married early, and I was happy to find that my wife shared my love for pets. Seeing my fondness for animals, she brought home many different kinds. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This cat was a large, beautiful animal, completely black and very intelligent. My wife, who had a bit of superstition in her, often mentioned the old belief that black cats were witches in disguise. She didn't really believe it, but she liked to joke about it. The cat, whose name was Pluto, was my favorite pet and playmate. I fed him, and he followed me everywhere in the house. It was even hard to stop him from following me outside. Our friendship lasted for several years, during which my character changed for the worse. I became more moody, more irritable, and less caring about others. I began to use harsh language with my wife, and eventually I even became violent with her. My pets, of course, felt the change in my behavior. I began to neglect and mistreat them. However, I still had enough affection for Pluto that I didn't hurt him like I did the other animals. But my condition worsened, and soon even Pluto felt the effects of my bad temper. One night, I came home drunk and thought Pluto was avoiding me. I grabbed him, and in his fear, he bit me lightly on the hand. Suddenly, a wave of anger swept over me. I felt like a demon had taken control of me. I no longer recognized myself. My original soul seemed to leave my body, and a cruel, fiendish spirit took over. I pulled out a penknife from my pocket, grabbed the poor animal by the throat, and deliberately cut out one of his eyes. I blush, burn, and shudder while writing about this terrible act. The next morning, when reason returned, and I had slept off the effects of the alcohol, I felt a sense of horror and regret for the crime I had committed. But this feeling was weak and didn't touch my soul. I soon drowned my memory of the deed in more alcohol. Meanwhile, the cat slowly recovered. The empty socket where his eye used to be was frightening to look at, but he didn't seem to be in pain anymore. He went about the house as usual, but he was terrified of me. At first, I felt sad that a creature who once loved me so much now feared me. But this feeling soon turned into irritation. Then, as if to complete my downfall, I was overcome by a spirit of perverseness, a desire to do wrong for the sake of doing wrong. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose around the cat's neck and hung him from a tree. I did this with tears streaming down my face and bitter regret in my heart. I hung him because I knew he had loved me, and because I knew he hadn't done anything to deserve this. I hung him because I knew it was a sin, a deadly sin that could damn my soul forever. That night, I was awakened by a cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames, and the entire house was burning. My wife, a servant, and I barely escaped. The house was completely destroyed, and all my worldly possessions were lost. I gave in to despair. The next day, I visited the ruins of the house. The walls had collapsed, except for one. This wall stood in the middle of the house and had the head of my bed against it. The plaster on this wall had resisted the fire, probably because it had been applied recently. A crowd had gathered around this wall, examining it closely. They were saying things like strange and remarkable, which caught my attention. I approached and saw, etched into the white surface of the wall, the figure of a giant cat. The image was incredibly clear, and there was a rope around the cat's neck. At first, I was filled with wonder and terror, but eventually I remembered that I had hung the cat in the garden next to the house. When the fire broke out, the garden must have filled with people. Someone must have cut the cat down from the tree and thrown it through an open window to wake me up. The falling walls must have pressed the cat's body into the plaster, and the heat and chemicals from the body must have created the image I saw. Although I could explain the image to myself, it still left a deep impression on my mind. For months, I couldn't shake the image of the cat from my thoughts. During this time, I even began to regret losing the animal. I started looking around the places I frequented for another cat that looked like Pluto to take its place. One night, while I was sitting in a filthy bar, half drunk, I noticed a black object on top of a large barrel of gin or rum. I had been staring at the barrel for a while and was surprised that I hadn't noticed the object earlier. I got up and touched it. It was a black cat, as large as Pluto, and very similar to him in every way except one. Pluto had no white hair, but this cat had a large, undefined splotch of white on its chest. When I touched the cat, it purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and seemed pleased with my attention. This was exactly the kind of pet I was looking for. I offered to buy it from the owner of the bar, but he claimed he didn't know anything about the cat and had never seen it before. I continued to pet the cat, and when I left the bar, it followed me home. I allowed it to come along, occasionally stopping to pat it as we walked. When we reached my house, the cat made itself at home and quickly became a favorite with my wife. However, I soon found myself disliking the cat. This was the opposite of what I had expected, but I couldn't help it. Its affection for me made me feel uneasy and annoyed. These feelings grew stronger over time, and I began to hate the creature. I avoided it, and although I didn't physically harm it, I couldn't stand to be around it. The cat reminded me too much of my past cruelty, and I was filled with loathing whenever it was near. What made me hate the cat even more was discovering that, like Pluto, this cat was also missing an eye. This only made my wife love it more, but I couldn't stand it. The cat followed me everywhere, and its affection for me seemed to grow as my hatred for it increased. It would sit under my chair or climb onto my lap, covering me with its unpleasant caresses. I longed to kill it, but I was afraid to do so, partly because of my guilt over what I had done to Pluto, and partly because I was terrified of this new cat. This terror wasn't physical fear, but something else. I was almost ashamed to admit it, but I was scared because of a strange idea that had taken hold of my mind. My wife had pointed out the white mark on the cat's chest, which had originally been very unclear. But over time, the mark had become more defined, and I could no longer ignore it. It had taken the shape of something I was too afraid to name. It looked like the image of a gallows, a symbol of horror, crime, and death. This realization filled me with dread, and I desperately wanted to get rid of the cat, but I didn't dare to. Now, I was more miserable than I had ever been. A mere animal, similar to the one I had cruelly killed, was causing me unbearable pain. I could no longer find peace, day or night. The cat never left me alone during the day, and at night, I woke up in terror to find its hot breath on my face and its heavy body pressing down on my chest like a living nightmare. Under the weight of this torment, whatever goodness was left in me disappeared. Dark thoughts filled my mind, and I began to hate everything and everyone. My anger grew more intense, and my poor wife, who never complained, became the victim of my rage. One day, She accompanied me into the cellar of our old house to do some household chores. The cat followed us down the stairs, almost causing me to fall. This made me so angry that I picked up an axe and aimed a blow at the cat, forgetting my fear. But my wife stopped my hand. Her interference pushed me into a rage beyond anything I had ever felt before. I pulled my arm free and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead on the spot without a sound. After the murder, I set about hiding the body. I knew I couldn't move it out of the house without being seen, so I thought about different ways to dispose of it. I considered cutting the body into pieces and burning them, burying it in the cellar, or throwing it into the well in the yard. But finally, I decided to wall it up in the cellar, just like the monks in the Middle Ages were said to have done to their victims. The cellar was well suited for this purpose. Its walls were loosely built and had recently been plastered. One of the walls had a bump where a false chimney or fireplace had been filled in. I was sure I could remove the bricks, hide the body inside, and then replace the bricks so that no one would notice anything. And I was right. I used a crowbar to remove the bricks and carefully placed the body behind the wall. Then I put the bricks back in place and covered them with plaster, making sure everything looked as it had before. When I was done, I felt satisfied that I had covered my tracks. The wall showed no sign of being disturbed, and I cleaned up all the debris from the floor. My next step was to find the cat and kill it. I had finally decided to put an end to the creature that had caused me so much misery. But the cat seemed to sense my anger and didn't show itself. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief at its absence. That night, for the first time since the cat had come into our home, I slept soundly, even though I had murder on my conscience. The second and third days passed, and still the cat didn't appear. I felt free again. I was sure the cat had run away, and I would never see it again. My happiness was complete, and the guilt of my dark deed barely troubled me. A few people had asked questions, and even a search had been conducted, but nothing was found. I felt confident that my future happiness was secure. On the fourth day after the murder, a group of police officers came to the house unexpectedly and conducted a thorough search. I wasn't worried, as I was sure my secret was safe. The officers searched every corner of the house, and finally, for the third or fourth time, they went down into the cellar. I remained calm and walked around the cellar with them, folding my arms and pacing back and forth. The police were satisfied with their search and were about to leave. My heart was filled with a sense of triumph, and I couldn't resist saying a few words to make sure they were convinced of my innocence. "Gentlemen," I said as they started to climb the stairs, "I'm glad I've been able to clear up your suspicions. I wish you all good health and a bit more courtesy. By the way, this is a well-built house, isn't it?" In my eagerness to say something, I didn't even know what I was talking about. "Yes, a very well-built house. These walls are solid." And with that, I knocked on the wall where I had hidden my wife's body. But may God protect me from the evil that followed. As soon as the sound of my knocking died away, I was answered by a voice from within the wall, a muffled and broken cry, like the sobbing of a child, which then grew into a long, loud, and continuous scream, filled with horror and triumph. It was a howl, a wailing shriek, as if it came from the throats of the damned in hell and the demons who rejoiced in their suffering. I cannot describe my thoughts. In a daze, I staggered to the opposite wall. For a moment, the officers stood frozen in terror and awe. Then, a dozen strong arms began to tear at the wall. It collapsed, revealing the decayed and bloody body of my wife, standing upright before the eyes of the spectators. On her head, with its mouth wide open and one fiery eye glaring, sat the horrible beast whose cunning had led me to murder, and whose voice had condemned me to the gallows. I had walled the monster up inside the tomb,